Welcome to Dead Set History Checked. Today, we will check the history of India and discuss how India might have looked if it had not been invaded.
That is, that is a massive premise.
It is, isn't it?
Probably one of the heaviest what-ifs you can pull on the thread of global history. It changes. Well, it changes almost everything.
It really does. And usually when we do these deep dives, we like to keep things, a little light, maybe a bit breezy. But today,
This one feels different.
this one feels different. I want to frame this for you not as some kind of comfort listen, and definitely not as a nationalistic fantasy. I think we should approach this as a controlled burn.
A controlled burn, that's a very specific, very evocative image. What do you mean by that? Clearing away the underbrush to see the landscape underneath.
Exactly that. We are trying to carefully, methodically strip away a millennium of history. Specifically, the narrative that external conquest was somehow inevitable.
Right.
We want to see what the bedrock of the Indian subcontinent actually looked like, and more importantly, what it could have built on its own.
So we're talking about breaking the chain of events?
The entire chain. Right from the very first link, from the northwest, the Ghaznavids, the Ghurids, all of that pressure coming over the mountains.
And then later from the sea.
And later from the sea
Yeah.
with the Europeans. We are looking at a huge stretch of time here, from 1000 CE all the way up to 2000 CE, a full 1,000 years.
That is an enormous scope. And I really like that controlled burn analogy because, fire is dangerous. If you don't manage it, it gets completely out of control. And when people try to do counterfactual history, especially with a topic as charged as this one, they tend to fall into traps.
What kind of traps?
Well, they want their side to win, so they invent magic.
Yeah.
Or they want to demonize the invaders so much that they completely ignore the internal failures that made invasion possible in the first place. It becomes a fantasy.
Right. So before we strike the match on this controlled burn, we need to set some ground rules. We need to establish the safety parameters.
The anti-cheat rules, yeah. We have to do that right at the start.
Okay, lay them out for us. What's rule number 1?
Rule number 1, and this is non-negotiable, no magic. We cannot invent technologies or social attitudes that didn't exist, or at the very least weren't chemically possible at the time.
So no giving 11th century Indian kings machine guns?
No machine guns, no satellite imagery to spot invading armies. We have to work with the tools they actually had or could have plausibly developed.
So no secret Wakanda scenario where they had lasers hidden in a temple in 1100 AD.
Exactly. We have to stick to the realm of the possible, which leads to rule number 2. No utopia.
This is a huge one.
It's crucial. A sovereign, unconquered India is not a paradise. It still has wars. It still has terrible droughts. It still has a rigid caste hierarchy, and it certainly has a lot of internal violence.
Right. Sovereignty doesn't mean everyone is happy and holding hands.
Not at all. It just means the decisions, and importantly the mistakes, are being made locally by local people for local reasons, not by an extractive foreign power.
That's a crucial distinction. We aren't building a heaven. We're building a state with all its flaws. Okay, what's the third rule?
The third is no demonization. Look, in our actual timeline, history is bloody. There's no getting around that.
Right.
We have horrific conquest violence. We have colonial famines that killed millions. We are going to discuss those historical atrocities honestly. But we have to attribute them to specific regimes, specific kings, specific policies. We are not going to paint entire religions or entire peoples with one brush as inherently evil. We're looking at the mechanics of power, not passing some kind of cosmic judgment.
Okay, so our guardrails are up. No magic, no utopia, no demonization.
Got it.
So let's talk about the big picture. When people imagine an unconquered India, I think the image that comes to mind is one giant unified empire.
Yeah.
Single color on the map from Kabul to Kanyakumari.
It's like a saffron map, yeah.
Exactly. But looking at the sources you pulled, it's not really the most likely outcome, is it?
No, and that's probably the most fascinating and counterintuitive part of this whole thought experiment. We aren't looking for a United States of India in 1100 CE. It's much more likely we'd see something that resembles Europe.
Europe. That seems backwards. How so?
Well, think about Europe's structure for most of its history. It's a collection of strong, constantly competing states. You've got France, Germany, England, Spain.
Right, always at war with each other.
Always at war or trading or making alliances or intermarrying. They share a culture, a kind of civilizational grammar. Latin, Christianity, Roman law, but they do not share a government. And for the most part, they never have.
So you're picturing an India that is a multi-state system. a dense, competitive ecology of different kingdoms.
Exactly. And that brings us to the central mechanism, the engine of this entire deep dive. It's a concept from political science called war-state formation.
Okay, what's that?
It's a theory most associated with the sociologist Charles Tilly. And the basic idea, to put it crudely, is war makes the state and the state makes war.
How does that work?
If you are constantly fighting for your survival against an enemy who is roughly your equal a peer competitor, you get very efficient very quickly. You have to raise taxes better. You have to build more professional armies. You have to improve your technology.
Because if you don't.
If you don't, you get wiped out. Your neighbor conquers you. So this constant grinding competition forces states to become stronger, more centralized, and more sophisticated. We're applying that logic to the Indian kingdoms of the 11th century.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this. To see where this great divergence happens, we have to understand the baseline. Let's drop ourselves right into the year 1000 CE. Paint a picture for us. What does the map of the subcontinent look like?
It is a vibrant mosaic.
Yeah.
It is absolutely not a power vacuum, just waiting for someone to come in and fill it. That's a colonial myth.
Come up there.
In the north, you have the remnants of what was the big imperial power, the Gurjara Pratiharas, but they're fragmenting. And rising out of that fragmentation, you have the Rajput confederacies, the Paramaras, the Chahamanas, the Chandelas. These are powerful martial cultures. They have strong armies, incredible forts, but they are deeply disunited. They see each other as rivals more than they see any external threat.
Well, what about in the south?
The south is a different beast entirely. In the year 1000, you have the Chola Empire.
Right.
And we have to be clear, under Rajaraja Hirth and then his son Rajendra Thirst, the Cholas are a genuine superpower, not just a regional one. They aren't just a land power. They are projecting serious naval force across the entire Indian Ocean. They've taken Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and they're launching expeditions, actual naval raids, against the Sriwijaya Empire in Southeast Asia.
That's modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia.
It is. It's just wild to think about that. An Indian empire launching amphibious assaults on Indonesia in the 11th century. It completely shatters the whole perception of a passive, inward-looking India.
It really does. Okay, so we have the feuding Rajputs in the north, the Chola superpower in the south. What about the frontier, the point of contact?
The frontier. This is the absolute key to our story. You have the doorkeepers.
The Hindu Shahi kingdom.
That's right. They're based in what's now Kabul and Gandhara, eastern Afghanistan and northern Pakistan. They are literally holding the Khyber Pass. They are the first line of defense against all that pressure building up in Central Asia.
They are the cork in the bottle.
It's a perfect analogy. And in 1000 CE, that cork is under immense pressure.
Now let's talk money, because something that really stands out when you look at the research, specifically the Madison historical economic data, is just how mind-bogglingly rich this region was.
It's staggering. It's hard to wrap your head around the numbers. According to the late Angus Madison, who did the most comprehensive work on this, in the year 1000 CE, the Indian subcontinent represents roughly 28.9% of the world's GDP.
28.9%.
Yes.
Let's put that in perspective. Today, the United States is what, 24% of the world's GDP?
Around that, yes. So you're looking at an economy that was, in relative terms, larger and more central to the global system than the U.S. is today.
Wow. And what's driving that economy? Is it all just farming?
It's a primarily agrarian economy, of course. Most pre-modern economies were. But it's one that is deeply integrated into global trade. You have these incredible merchant guilds like the Iowa 500.
The Iowa 500? That sounds like a NASCAR race.
It does, doesn't it? But it was actually this massive, powerful merchant guild based in southern India.
What's a guild in this context?
You should think of them less like a union and more like a medieval multinational corporation.
Yeah.
They had their own flags, their own charters, even their own private security forces to protect their caravans and ships.
Private armies.
Absolutely. And they were moving high-value goods all across the Indian Ocean basin. Indian textiles, spices from the Malabar coast, gems from Sri Lanka. They were, in a very real sense, the glue holding the entire Asian economy together.
So this brings us to the million-dollar question. Or, I guess, the trillion rupee question.
Go for it.
If India was so rich, so populous, and had these powerful martial cultures like the Rajputs and world-class naval powers like the Cholas, why did the invasion succeed in our timeline? Why did the Hindu Shahi doorkeepers eventually fall?
It comes down to a few critical structural vulnerabilities. It was not a lack of courage. It was not a lack of manpower. It was about specific weaknesses in the system.
Okay, like what?
The first, and maybe the most important, is what historians call the cavalry gap.
Horses.
It all comes down to horses. The invaders coming from Central Asia, the Ghaznavids, and later the Ghurids and others, they brought a new kind of warfare. It was based on mobile, mounted archers.
Right.
India simply lacked good pasture land for breeding high-quality war horses. The climate, the heat, the humidity, the types of vegetation, it's just not conducive to raising large herds of war horses.
They had to import them.
Exactly. They had to import them mostly from Arabia or Central Asia, which is incredibly expensive and creates a huge logistical bottleneck. You're always dependent on your potential enemy for your key military hardware.
So what did the Indian armies rely on instead?
They relied on two things: heavy infantry and war elephants.
Elephants.
And here's the fundamental tactical problem. An elephant is like a tank. It's terrifying, it's powerful, it can break through a line of infantry, but a horse archer is like a fighter jet.
Explain that.
An elephant is slow, it's a huge target, and if you can panic an elephant with fire or loud noises or enough arrows, what does it do? It turns around and tramples your own lines. It becomes a liability. The mobile horse archers could just dance around the Indian formations, peppering them with arrows, refusing to engage in a direct fight, and waiting for the elephants to break.
That's a massive tactical disadvantage. What was the second vulnerability?
An intelligence failure,
Yeah.
a profound one. There was no early warning system on the frontier. The Rajput states, the Cholas, the Palace in Bengal, they were so focused on fighting each other for territory and prestige that they often didn't know an external army was massing on the frontier until it was already through the passes and sieging a city.
They were looking inward, competing with each other, not looking outward at the real threat.
Perfectly put. And finally, there's a more philosophical issue. It's the issue of battle norms.
You're talking about Dharmayuddha.
Yes, the concept of Dharmayuddha, righteous, ethical, ritualized warfare.
The idea that there are rules to war. You don't fight after sunset. You don't strike an enemy who is retreating. You don't harm non-combatants.
Exactly. It's a very noble, very civilized code of conduct. But there's a problem.
What's the problem?
The problem is when you're fighting an enemy who is not playing by those rules. An enemy who is fighting a total war for survival, for plunder, for political dominance. If you subscribe to Dharmayuddha and your opponent doesn't, it becomes a strategic liability.
So if you defeat an army in battle, and then you let them retreat honorably.
He just comes back next year with a bigger army, having learned from his mistakes. Which is precisely what happened in our timeline between Prithviraj Chauhan and Muhammad Ghori at the battles of Turin. The first time, Prithviraj wins and lets Ghori go. The second time, Ghori comes back and destroys him.
Okay, so that's the baseline. A rich, powerful, fragmented, and perhaps slightly naive giant.
That's a good summary.
Now let's start the controlled burn. We're moving to section 2, the divergence. The period is roughly 1000 to 1150 CE. In our history, Mahmud of Ghazni comes down from Afghanistan, raids the subcontinent 17 times, sacks the Great Temple at Somnath, and effectively breaks the back of the frontier resistance.
He drains the north of its wealth and its confidence.
So in our counterfactual, how does that not happen? How do they stop him without inventing machine guns?
They stop him by adapting, by getting smarter and tougher. We call this the pragmatic shift.
And where does that shift start?
It starts with intelligence. With that early warning system, we said they were lacking.
Okay.
The counterfactual assumes that the frontier states, the Hindu Shahis and their Rajput neighbors, realize after maybe the first or second raid that this is a new kind of war. This isn't a dynastic squabble. This is existential.
So what do?
They start using those vast merchant networks we talked about earlier, the Ayavul 500 and others. They essentially turn their traders into spies.
So instead of just selling textiles and spices along the Kabul-Peshawar corridor,
the merchants are now also counting soldiers, they're mapping supply depots, they're listening for mobilization orders in the bazaars of Ghazni and Kabul. They provide an early warning. They know when Mahmud is mobilizing, how big his army is, and what his likely route will be.
and what does that early warning allow the Indian kings to do?
It allows them to use the second tool of this pragmatic shift, scorched earth.
Denying the enemy supplies, denying the loot.
Precisely. You have to understand, Mahmud's raids were largely economic ventures. He wasn't trying to colonize India at first. He was trying to fund his massive empire back in Ghazni. He needed gold, he needed slaves, he needed resources to pay his troops.
So if he crosses the Khyber Pass with his huge army and finds the granaries ahead of him are empty, the wells have been poisoned, and the temple treasuries have already been moved to a secure hill fort.
The whole raid becomes a financial disaster for him.
Right. An army marches on its stomach.
It does. And if a raid yields no loot, he can't pay his soldiers. And if he can't pay his Turkic soldiers, they mutiny. It turns the invasion from a highly profitable venture into a catastrophic drain on his own resources. He might try it once or twice, but he can't sustain it.
Okay, that makes sense economically. But what about militarily? You still have the elephant versus horse archer problem?
You absolutely do. So you stop fighting the battles they want you to fight. You stop meeting them in open plains where their cavalry has the advantage. You shift your entire strategy to a zone defense.
What does that mean?
It means you use the terrain. India is a land of forts. You retreat your main armies into a network of interlocking, well-supplied fortifications. You force the invaders to lay siege to these positions one by one, and horse archers are almost useless against high stone walls.
Sieges are long and expensive. They eat up time and resources.
Exactly. The invader gets bogged down, his supply lines get longer and more vulnerable to guerrilla attacks. The hot Indian summer arrives, disease breaks out in his camp, and eventually he has to retreat with very little to show for it.
This sounds like a massive shift in philosophy, too. You mentioned Dharma Yuddha earlier. Poisoning wells, hiding in forts, refusing a decisive battle. That doesn't sound very dharmic or honorable.
It isn't. It's the opposite.
Oh.
But here's the thing, and our sources are crystal clear on this. India already had a detailed manual for exactly this kind of warfare.
Your Arthashastra.
Kautilya's Arthashastra, yes. It dates back to the Maurya era, over 1,000 years before this period.
And it's not about noble warfare.
Not at all. It is a ruthless, pragmatic manual for statecraft. It's about spies, assassinations, propaganda, and what it calls kutayuddha, which basically means crooked, deceitful warfare.
A deception war.
Yes. The knowledge was already there. The counterfactual assumes that under the existential threat of these raids, the Indian rulers stop worrying about looking noble in some abstract sense and start worrying about sheer survival. They dust off the Arthashastra and start fighting dirty because they have no other choice.
So the result of all this is that Mahmud of Ghazni is checked. Maybe he burns a few border villages, but he doesn't get to Somnath. He doesn't shatter the northern kingdoms. He doesn't drain the wealth of the subcontinent.
And that has a massive cascading second-order effect. All that wealth, the gold in the temples, the grain in the state silos, it stays in India.
And it gets reinvested.
It gets reinvested. The temple endowments, which were like the banks and universities of their day, they remain intact to fund local agriculture, to maintain the irrigation tanks and canals, and crucially, to fund defense and build better forts. The capital doesn't get exported to Central Asia.
So the doorkeepers hold the door. The chain of conquest is broken at the very first link.
The first and most critical link.
So now we move forward into the deep waters of the timeline. We are looking at this huge period from 1200 all the way to 1800 CE. Without the Delhi Sultanate, without the Mughal Empire, what does the political map of India even look like? Our research suggests there isn't just one answer. There are 3 possible timelines.
That's right. These are branching scenarios. They're based on probability and what we know about state formation. The first one, and I think the most likely, is what we call the Confederate Shield.
And this is the Europe-like outcome you mentioned earlier.
This is the most Europe-like outcome, yes. In this scenario, no single emperor ever manages to conquer the entire subcontinent. Instead, you have a persistent multi-state system.
So the Rajput confederacies in the north, the successor states to the Cholas in the south, may be a strong power in Bengal or Odisha.
Exactly. They are all sovereign states. And let's be clear, they fight each other constantly, over land, over trade routes, over prestige. But, and this is the absolute key to this timeline, they form leagues, temporary alliances to defend the frontier.
Like a medieval NATO or something.
Or like the Hanseatic League in the Baltic, a defensive pact. The core logic is, we may hate each other, but we hate the invaders from the outside even more.
And that competition drives innovation.
That's the engine of war state formation. Because they're constantly competing with each other and with external threats, they are forced to innovate. They need better steel for their swords, better ships for their navies, better fortifications for their cities, better tax collection to pay for it all. The result is high commercial wealth, a technologically dynamic region, but one that is always politically fragmented.
Okay, that's timeline 1. What's the second possibility?
Timeline 2 is the paramountcy. This is the new empire outcome. Suppose one of these states, maybe the Paramars of Malwa or a revived Rashtrakuta-style power in the Deccan, wins the internal game. They get the upper hand over their rivals and manage to centralize power.
So this looks more like the great empires of India's past, like the Mauryas or the Guptas.
Exactly. You get a centralized taxation system, a single standing professional army, a unified command structure.
What are the pros and cons of that?
The pro is that this timeline offers by far the strongest military defense against outsiders. You have a single massive state able to mobilize huge resources. It probably leads to state-sponsored projects, maybe even early industrialization. But the con is that it carries the immense risk of tyranny, over-centralization, and catastrophic collapse if the central dynasty fails or rots from within.
Right. It's all your eggs in one basket.
Precisely. And what's the third timeline?
The third one we've called the delayed fracture. This is the hybrid outcome. It's a bit messier.
How so?
In this scenario, the United Indian Resistance holds for a century or two, maybe until 1150 or 1200, and then fractures due to internal rivalries. The Central Asian powers, the Turks, the Afghans, do eventually enter India, but they don't enter as overwhelming conquerors into a power vacuum.
So how do they enter?
They enter as players in an already crowded game. They become mercenaries, partners in alliances, or carve out small, localized tributary states.
So you get a synthesis of cultures, but without the total political subjugation.
Yes, you get a soft synthesis. It might be culturally very rich, something like the Indo-Islamic culture of the early Mughal period, but it would be politically very unstable. You don't get the deep, systematic, extractive machinery of the historical Delhi Sultanate, but you also don't get the strong, resilient sovereignty of the Confederate Shield timeline. For the sake of this deep dive, let's lean into that first timeline, the most probable one, the Confederate Shield.
The Europe like India.
Yes, because that competitive, wealthy, fragmented India sets up the most interesting economic question of all. We have to talk about the Great Divergence.
Ah, the great economic debate. This is where things get really technical, but it is so, so important.
Just the whole ball game, really. In our timeline, as everyone knows, Britain industrializes first. Steam engines, textile mills, railways, the whole 9 yards. It creates a massive power imbalance between Europe and the rest of the world.
The world we still live in today was forged in that moment.
Right. But in this counterfactual, India isn't colonized. It keeps its wealth. It maintains its position as, say, 25% of the world's GDP. We know it has these great knowledge institutions. In this timeline, a university like Nalanda isn't burned down by invaders. We know it has the Kerala School of Mathematics, which was developing calculus-adjacent methods centuries before Newton and Leibniz.
The groundwork is there.
So the big question is, if India isn't colonized, does it have an industrial revolution before Britain?
It is so tempting to just say, yes, absolutely. It feels like the right answer. You look at the evidence. India had the capital. It had the world's leading textile industry.
To the point that the British were actively trying to block Indian imports.
They were. The Calico Acts passed by the British Parliament in the 18th century were pure protectionism. They were trying to protect their own weavers from superior, cheaper Indian cloth. India had the technical skill. It had the trade networks. It looks like a slam dunk.
What? I can hear a but coming in your voice.
But industrialization isn't just about being rich or smart. It's about incentives. You have to ask a very basic question. Why did Britain invent all those machines in the first place?
To make more stuff faster.
Yes, but why did they need to? Because they had a very specific economic combination. They had very cheap energy in the form of abundant coal right near the surface, and they had increasingly expensive labor as wages for workers were rising.
So they needed machines to replace expensive workers.
They had a massive financial incentive to invent machines that could save on labor costs. Now, what was the situation in India?
The opposite.
The exact opposite. India had, for most of its history, abundant and distinctively cheap labor. When you have millions of incredibly skilled artisans who can weave the most beautiful cloth in the world by hand, for very low wages, you have very little economic incentive to spend a fortune inventing a complex, steam-powered loom to replace them.
It's the high-level equilibrium trap.
That's the term economists use. You are doing so well with the old methods, you're so profitable, that you don't feel the pressure to make the disruptive, expensive leap to brand new ones.
So even with all that money and knowledge, They might not build the factories because it's just cheaper to hire more people?
It's a very real possibility. Plus, there's another missing piece, the question of the scientific revolution. Did India have that very specific Baconian culture of experimental mechanics? The tinkering, the taking things apart just to see how they work, the obsession with precision instruments?
The Kerala school was doing theoretical math.
Brilliant theoretical math. But was it being applied to building better pumps to get water out of mines? That's a different kind of knowledge system. It's debatable whether that was present.
So what's the final verdict? Does an independent India industrialize?
I think the most plausible verdict is that yes, it does, but it likely happens later than in Britain. Maybe it starts in the mid-19th century as they see what's happening in Europe and start to adapt the technology. But, and this is a monumental, but it is organic and it is sovereign.
What does that look like in practice? What's the difference?
It means that when India does build railways, they are owned by Indian capital, not British investors. They are designed to connect Indian cities to each other, to boost internal trade, not just to haul raw materials from the interior to the ports for export.
So the infrastructure serves the Indian economy first.
Yes, when they build shipyards, they're building ships for an Indian Navy and an Indian merchant marine. Most importantly, you avoid the catastrophic deindustrialization shock that happened under the British, where they systematically dismantled India's existing textile industry to create a captive market for their own mills in Manchester.
So you might be a few decades late to the steam-powered party, but you own the house.
You own the house, you control the guest list, and you collect the profits. It's a fundamentally different world.
Let's pivot from the economy to society. Because one of our foundational rules was no utopia. So if we don't have centuries of invasion and colonial rule, is this simply a better, fair place to live for the average person?
Now that is the most complicated and frankly uncomfortable part of this whole exercise.
Why?
Because you might instinctively think no invasion means no oppression, but that is just not true. In fact, one could make a strong argument that without the massive disruption of foreign conquest, the indigenous social hierarchy Brahminical orthodoxy might actually become more rigid, not less.
The caste system could harden?
It's entirely possible. Sometimes external shocks, however brutal, force societies to become more fluid and question their own structures. Without that shock, the old hierarchies can calcify. The kings rely on the priests for legitimacy, the priests rely on the kings for protection and patronage, and the lower caste gets squeezed and locked into place.
But at the same time, you have a powerful counterforce welling up from within Indian society itself, the Bhakti movement.
The great devotional movement, yes. You have these incredible figures, saints, poets, reformers, Kabir, Guru Nanak, Ravidas, Mirabai, Tukaram.
Right. And they were all, in their own ways, pushing for a more egalitarian spirituality, for a direct personal connection to the divine that bypasses the caste hierarchy and the complex rituals of the priests.
That's the core of it. In our timeline, the Bhakti movement is often seen as a kind of two-front response. A response to both the egalitarian message of Islam on one side and the rigidities of establishment Hinduism on the other.
So what happens in a timeline without that Islamic political dominance?
The struggle still happens. But it happens entirely internally. It becomes a purely Indian conversation about Indian inequality. It might even become more intense, more pointed, because the other isn't a foreign invader with a different faith. The other is your own entrenched social structure. It's a civilizational self-correction.
And in our Confederate Shield timeline, the one with all the merchants and trade commerce itself might play a role in social change.
Absolutely. Money is a great solvent of old hierarchies. In a merchant war state, what a king values most is competence.
Not your bloodline.
Not your bloodline. If you need a good navy to compete with the kingdom next door, you can't afford to care if your best ship captain or sailor is from the wrong caste. You just need him to be able to sail the ship and fight. If you need a banker, you need someone who understands finance, not just someone with the right last name. Markets, by their nature, might erode caste rigidities faster than laws ever could. If you can make money, you get power and mobility.
Okay, this is where it gets really, really interesting. We have to move forward to Section 6, the colonial fork. The year is 1498. Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, has successfully sailed his ships around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and arrives on the coast of India, in Calicut.
A pivotal moment in world history.
In our history, this is the beginning of the end for Indian sovereignty. It's the thin end of the wedge.
Right.
What happens in this timeline?
This is my favorite part of the entire thought experiment because everything changes. Vasco da Gama arrives, he's got his sturdy caravels, he's got his cannons, he's got his crusading attitude, but he does not meet a collection of small, fragmented coastal principalities ruled by a distracted inland empire. He meets the coastline of a Chola-style naval coalition.
Right. We have to remember the Cholas were projecting serious naval power back in 1000 CE. By 1498, that maritime tradition has had another 500 years to evolve and adapt in a competitive environment.
Exactly. And because the trade with China and the Arab world was never systematically disrupted in this timeline, India has gunpowder technology. They've been using it for a while. Their ships, which are large and well-built, are likely armed with locally made bronze cannons.
So Gamma shows up, expecting to be able to intimidate and bully the locals with his superior firepower.
And he finds to his shock that he's outgunned, or at the very least, he's met his match. He can't just sail into Calicut's harbor and bombard the city into submission. The shore batteries will blow him out of the water. The local navy will swarm him.
So no Portuguese domination of the Indian Ocean trade routes.
Not the kind of total, violent domination they achieved historically. Look, the Portuguese were tough, brilliant sailors. But they succeeded because they could divide and conquer the local powers, and because, for a crucial few decades, they had a decisive technological edge with their shipboard artillery.
And in this timeline, they have neither.
They have neither. The Indian states have technological parity or something close to it, and because of the constant threat on their land frontier, they have a well-practiced habit of forming defensive coalitions, so they are forced to deal with the Europeans using a completely different model.
The model becomes trade, not rule.
Trade, not rule. That is the perfect summary. The Europeans, the Portuguese, and later the Dutch, the French, and the British are forced to operate in India the same way they were forced to operate in China or Japan. They are confined to small trade enclaves, treaty ports.
Like Macau in China, or Dejima Island for the Dutch in Japan.
Exactly like that. The local Indian ruler says, you want to buy our pepper and our textiles? Fine. You can build a factory, a warehouse in this specific zone on the coast. You will pay your taxes and your customs duties. You will obey our laws. But you do not bring your army inland, and if you cause any trouble, we will revoke your license and kick you out.
So this means, and this is the absolute crucial point, you don't get the Battle of Plassey in 1757.
No Plassey. That moment, that pivot point where the English East India Company transforms from a humble merchant group into a territorial sovereign ruler, that simply never happens. Because no strong sovereign Indian state in a competitive militarized system would ever grant a foreign company, the Diwani, the right to collect its internal land taxes. That is the core function of a state. Giving it away is state suicide.
And if the East India Company can't collect taxes, they can't use that money to fund the massive private armies that they use to conquer the rest of India.
Correct. The entire business model of the Raj is dead on arrival. The Indian drain, the vast systematic transfer of wealth from India to Britain that funded its industrial revolution and its global empire, that drain never starts. Britain does not get that massive, unearned injection of capital.
Which changes the entire global balance of power.
Completely. Britain might still be a strong maritime trading power, but without the bottomless treasury of India to draw upon, can they afford the navy that defeated Napoleon? Can they dominate the entire 19th century in the way that they did?
It becomes much, much harder. The geopolitical and economic center of gravity might just stay in Asia for a lot longer.
It almost certainly does.
That brings us to the most difficult part of this, the moral accounting. Section 7. We promised a truth-forward lens. We have to look at the ledger of human suffering. In this alternate timeline, what disappears from history and what unfortunately stays.
Let's start with what disappears. The good news, if you can call it that. The most obvious things are the atrocities associated with the initial conquests of the early medieval period.
The sacks of cities like Delhi, the large-scale destruction of temples for political and ideological reasons.
That is either eliminated entirely or significantly reduced in scope. But the big one, the one that affected tens of millions of people, is the famines.
The colonial famines. We're talking about events like the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed maybe a third of the population, the Great Famine of 1876-78, and of course the one in living memory, the Bengal famine of 1943. 3 million people dead in 1943 alone.
At least 3 million. And we now know that was a famine that was catastrophically exacerbated, if not directly caused, by British imperial policy. Diverting rice from Bengal for the war effort, refusing international aid, implementing scorched earth policies to stop a potential Japanese advance. These were political decisions.
And you're saying that in a sovereign India, that doesn't happen?
That specific kind of policy-driven starvation does not happen.
Why not? A sovereign Indian king could be just as cruel.
He could be, but there's a difference in accountability. No local ruler, however tyrannical, is going to deliberately export grain from his kingdom while his own capital city is starving. Why? Because he fears a revolt that will overthrow him? His survival is tied to the survival of his people.
Whereas a foreign empire.
A foreign empire can afford to let millions of people starve in a distant colony because the decision makers are thousands of miles away in London and they face no direct consequences. Their legitimacy doesn't depend on the consent of the governed in Bengal.
And other colonial-era atrocities, something like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and Amritsar.
Gone, it disappears from history. There are no colonial troops firing on unarmed civilians because there is no colonial rule to maintain through terror.
But now, we have to look at the other side of the ledger. The bad news. What suffering persists?
The bad news is all internal. A Europe like India, as we've established, is a violent place. It is a continent that is constantly at war with itself. You have endless arms races between rival states, brutal border conflicts, rebellions, and crushingly high taxes to pay for all those armies.
And nature doesn't care about your political setup.
Not one bit. The monsoons are still going to fail in 1876 or 1899. Droughts are an inevitable part of the subcontinent's climate cycle.
So people will still die of hunger during a drought.
They absolutely will. The difference is in the state's response. It's the difference between sovereign relief efforts, however flawed, and organized colonial indifference. But yes, people still die. And all the internal social problems, caste violence, feudal exploitation of peasants, religious strife, those remain deeply rooted Indian problems that have to be solved by Indians.
So sovereignty is not the absence of suffering.
No.
It is the absence of extractive suffering.
That is a very powerful, very precise distinction. The suffering stays local, but the wealth also stays local, and the capacity to generate solutions, hopefully, also stays local.
So let's bring it all home. We've gone through 1,000 years of alternate history. Let's stand in the year 2000 CE in this timeline. What does the world see when it looks at the Indian subcontinent?
It sees something that looks politically a lot like the European Union.
Not one country.
Not one single country. It sees a collection of large sovereign states. Maybe there are 6, maybe there are 12 major powers. You might have the Kingdom of Bengal, the Maratha Confederacy in the west, a large Dravidian federation in the south, a Rajput state in the north.
So they're independent countries with their own passports and armies.
Yes, but they are deeply interconnected. They're bound together by free trade treaties, by thousands of years of shared culture, by a civilizational grammar that we might call Sanatana Dharma, not as a state religion or a theocracy, but as a shared cultural framework. They have open borders for pilgrims and scholars, but they have their own armies and their own currencies.
And what about their economic status on the world stage?
It's a first-rank economic power. No question. In our timeline, India's share of world GDP collapsed from around 25% in 1700 to less than 5% by the time of independence in 1947.
A historic deindustrialization.
The greatest in history. In this timeline, by retaining its capital, by avoiding colonial extraction, and by industrializing on its own terms, the subcontinent as a whole likely retains somewhere between 15% to 20% of the world's GDP.
That's an absolute powerhouse.
Yeah.
That's a world where the Asian century didn't need to begin in the year 2000. It just never ended.
It never ended.
So after all this, what does it all mean? What's the final takeaway for you, for the listener?
I think the takeaway is a provocation. We are so often taught to think of history as inevitable. The invasions had to happen. India was too divided, too weak. Colonialism had to happen to bring modernity. This thought experiment, if it does anything, should show that none of it was destiny.
It was a series of specific, contingent failures.
Yes, it was intelligence failures. It was technological gaps that weren't closed in time. It was a refusal to adapt tactics in the face of a new kind of threat. If those specific gaps had been plugged, if the doorkeepers had looked outward with the same intensity they looked inward, the entire story of the last 1,000 years changes.
The path to modernity didn't have to go through the trauma of colonialism.
No, it did not. And we've seen throughout this that sovereignty is not virtue. Indian kings could be just as tyrannical as any foreign ruler. But sovereignty is capacity.
Capacity.
It's the capacity to make your own mistakes and, crucially, to fix them yourself. It's the capacity to hold on to your own resources and use them to build your own future.
And that's the thought I want to leave all of you with today. This alternate history isn't about escapism. It asks us to look at the past not as inevitable victims, but as the story of survivors who had the tools, the wealth, and the knowledge to adapt, and to ask ourselves the hard question: why in our timeline were those tools not used in time?
A question worth asking for a very long time.
That's it for this deep dive into Project Dead Set. Check your mental notes, go back over those debate cards we laid out.
And keep thinking critically about the past.
We'll catch you on the next one.